So, according to the Universal Pictures schedule, there's an untitled Illumination Nintendo film scheduled for April 2028. What could this film be? Could it be Donkey Kong? Well, probably yes, especially since we know that there were patents relating to a Donkey Kong film going around last year. That said, there are other possibilities, and the timing is also worthy of some scrutiny, so let's dive into this. April is becoming very much Nintendo's movie month of choice. While Zelda was delayed out of April and into May for some kind of scheduling reason, it would seem, presumably on the studio side, this will be the fourth film to have targeted this particular window, and you can see why it would appeal to Nintendo. It gives them a second boost of attention in the opposite quarter from the peak holiday season, a second major selling window. And while I was a bit glib at the top of the video, there are definitely interesting possibilities that Nintendo could explore besides simply Donkey Kong, although Donkey Kong would also be massively exciting. For one thing, it mentions an event rather than just a film. I think this is just Hollywood speak frankly, but it's plausible, I guess, that they could be doing something off kilter with a cinema slot. This is Nintendo after all. Perhaps that's when they'll broadcast their next direct. But I think we should probably focus primarily on film options, and those options I think are generally fairly obvious. Now, we shouldn't rule out completely the unlikely possibilities. A lot of people felt confident about Nintendo going for the logical next step of Super Mario World for Movie 2, but they in fact leapfrogged the SNES Classic and went straight to Super Mario Galaxy, at least for the title, although obviously they included a lot more in that film. If they wanted to go straight for the big deal properties, a rather underrated possibility, it strikes me, is actually Animal Crossing. I'm extremely confident that Nintendo will want to launch a new Animal Crossing title around 2028 to 2029, and it will be difficult for them to recapture the unique Animal Crossing fever of 2020. There's a risk that, even if the game is truly excellent and worthy as a sequel, it will still be seen as the disappointing follow up to the huge hit that was New Horizons. The best thing Nintendo can do to give the game a leg up may be to launch a major movie to bolster attention for the property. In this case, I think it would break the rule that I usually expect Nintendo to have, that big new games follow after an event movie, because there's so little Animal Crossing content on the shelves at present, and while Animal Crossing New Horizons Nintendo Switch 2 edition may work for another tilt from existing players, I wonder how much leeway the game really has for new purchasers before they introduce a brand new title. Then, of course, there's Metroid. Nintendo has been going all out to make a moment around Metroid just recently, and when I say just recently, I mean for many years of development. And while Beyond might not have had quite the spark that they might have been hoping for, it does seem to me that the near inevitable arrival of a Metroid 6 pretty soon could be their big chance to drive a solid lineup of Metroid titles on the Switch family of systems around the time of a film launch. If they ever want to give a movie a tilt, surely it's now, while they have the developers, and when they can finally try to either make Metroid a success or surrender it to fate. The thing is, I'm just not sure I see the logic in Illumination taking on that film, a studio whose track record is for content that has a very different flavour from Metroid. For all that people are critical of Nintendo's treatment of Metroid at times over the years, I think they're quite respectful of the way it's perceived on balance, and I just don't think that this will be Illumination's next picture with Nintendo. So yes, the logical move is to double down on the Mario universe. There are four obvious spin-off directions based on existing properties that they have included in the films: Donkey Kong, Star Fox, Luigi's Mansion, and Yoshi's Island. Now, each of these are completely plausible in their own ways, based on the work Nintendo have already put into building up the universe, but I think we need to consider the potential for crossover effects with the rest of Nintendo's product line, notably their games, but also location, smartphone, and their merchandising business. The case for Donkey Kong is that it has a major actor behind it in Seth Rogen, who has been underutilized since the first film, and so it would make sense to move towards an original Donkey Kong title. We also have Bonanza on Switch 2 as a launch title, and it's quite possible by 2028 they could have a further Donkey Kong title or two, possibly another Donkey Kong Country title, possibly a Tropical Freeze Plus game, possibly even a racing title or something brand new. It feels like Nintendo could put a decent suite of titles behind a Donkey Kong film, and while as a property Donkey Kong might not be the biggest banana in the pile, he's still popular, still important to Nintendo, and he's Mario adjacent enough that he builds on the existing content library very effectively. Yoshi's Island feels a bit of a reach at this stage and might be better suited for a children's series rather than a full film, while Star Fox would be a very bold choice but might feel a bit experimental right now, just at this point in Nintendo's film career, since presumably this film was conceived and pitched before Super Mario Galaxy was even released, and so before they saw any signs of the particular reception for Fox McCloud. I don't doubt Nintendo has big plans for Star Fox, and hey, perhaps they figure they should strike while the iron is at least still lukewarm. It will be hard for them to bring Star Fox back at all, let alone after a break of many years since his last film cameo, so in that sense, maybe it is worth them pushing the matter right now. Given that I assume they aspire to bring back most of these properties to the screen, there is, at least in some respects therefore, less risk with using their current popularity with Star Fox to take a big swing, knowing that if they miss, they can always simply retrench to their more heartland properties. But the thing is, these kinds of films are not just in Nintendo's wheelhouse, they also negotiations with Universal and others, and I think Universal will be keener to get to the more obviously commercial properties before they take a chance on anything like Star Fox. But if there's one rival to the throne, it is Luigi's Mansion. What makes me pause, though, is the question of whether they would release an Illumination Luigi's Mansion in April, when it would so obviously be a better fit for the spooky season. However, I still think it's quite possible. For one thing, these schedules aren't cast in carbonite, they often change around, and as spoiler-averse a company as Nintendo might want to disguise an October placement, since it would so obviously hint at what the movie is before they're ready to announce it, if they put it in October. Besides, there are other considerations than theming. April has been a very good month for Nintendo, and they may decide that a spring release of the movie, followed by a home release merchandising push and a new game release in the October of 2028, might suit them far better. I also think we need to consider this in the context of the development of Luigi's Mansion 4. Now, I've been fairly down on the prospect of an imminent Luigi's Mansion for some time, even though it has been a regular one at the rumour mill. Next Level Games finished Luigi's Mansion 3 in 2019, but many of that core team were credited on Mario Strikers Battle League, released in 2022, so I'm skeptical that Luigi's Mansion 4 was in heavy development before that date. I also think the next title will be extremely significant in scope, given the huge sales of Luigi's Mansion 3 and the prominence of the Luigi character. I think Nintendo will see this event as being not far off the scale of one of their major Mario games, certainly well up there with big titles like Splatoon. Luigi's Mansion games are fairly significant once per generation deals at present, and so I think this could be their only significant crack at the property, at least at a mainline title, for a decade, meaning I don't expect them to rush it. They'll want this to be definitive for the Switch 2 generation. However, since Luigi's Mansion 2 on 3DS, the series has seemed to particularly connect to the handheld versions of their systems, and my speculation has long been that they might want to dovetail the release of a new Luigi's Mansion title to a prospective Switch 2 Lite. Even if the scope of the games no longer feels handheld in ghostly spirit, I suspect Nintendo see the theming of the little brother playing on the smaller console to be something that works for them by putting Luigi out around the time of the light versions of consoles. The question occurs to me of which of these projects would be the better fit for 2028 specifically. Logic, I think, would dictate Donkey Kong. He's easily separable from the main Mario line, and it could be just a massive impact on the property. There's also a deeper bench of Donkey Kong games, 3 major titles on Switch 2, plus Mario vs. Donkey Kong compared to just 2 Luigi's Mansion games, plus Mario and Luigi. But it's not just about the games that are on the bench, but the games they could put to market, and at the present time at least, Donkey Kong feels like there's far more scope for expansion than Luigi's Mansion, which is still quite a bespoke property. We could get the bongos back, perhaps have a new version of Jungle Beat, or even of the original trilogy, and of course we could have new utilizations of the property entirely, with brand new styles of games using the Donkey Kong IP. All that said, timing-wise, if 2028 isn't for Luigi, it does open the question of when Nintendo will commit to Luigi's Mansion. Theoretically, this year, the title will be in its fourth or fifth year in development. Next Level Games turned around games at a reliable cadence of about 3 years per title in recent times, but given the scope and the slowing of the pace of development, I don't necessarily think 4 is a safe bet to come out anytime soon. They've also been expanding as a team recently since Nintendo purchased them, and this kind of internal reorganization may lead to its own delays. There's also the Mario problem. If Luigi launched in 2027, and so does a 3D Mario, then Nintendo risk cannibalizing the Mario audience, and while the market is big enough to sustain two major games, I just don't know if it makes sense for Nintendo to risk even a mild overlap when they can make a big deal of Luigi separately. This is why I feel that 2028 will be a likely option, but if not, that still leaves 2029. Now, logically, according to the iron law of movie properties, you would expect 3 years after the last Mario film to deliver the third in the Mario trilogy. But since I see no likely endpoint to these films, it also strikes me as quite plausible that Nintendo and Illumination could want to do a detour through the Mushroom Kingdom before returning to Mario. I certainly can't imagine them sustaining 3 yearly Marios indefinitely, and they might want to build suspense for a new Mario in a little bit of a longer period, especially if it will involve playing off a game that they have yet to actually finish at the current time, and they need to release still in the form of their next 3D Mario title. Therefore, it feels quite plausible to me that the 2029 slot that will almost certainly be earmarked for a Mario title will turn out not to be the Mario 3 title, but indeed a Luigi's Mansion film instead, with Mario following perhaps for 2030 or 2031, tied to the Mario's 45th anniversary. Less auspicious than the 40th, but this didn't stop them with the 35th, so I doubt it'll be a problem at 45, especially since 2030 is a year they'll be hoping to do a Zelda sequel in, and as successful as they've been so far in the commercial sense, I think Nintendo probably do want to avoid going twice yearly just yet on their cinematic ventures to avoid audience fatigue. 2029 for a Luigi's Mansion movie would mean Next Level Games having 7 years to perfect their next game, which feels kind of commensurate with the kind of development times many of these top tier properties are now getting. It would also explain the lack of any kind of glow up on Luigi's Mansion 3 so far. The trend has been to bring the biggest Switch titles over to Switch 2 in some form, whether in the form of a free graphical uplift like with Odyssey, or with Nintendo Switch 2 editions as with Animal Crossing New Horizons. Granted, if they had a sequel lined up, they might not want to pay much attention to the prior version. They clearly didn't want to spike attention on Mario Kart 8 Deluxe when they were using World to shift consoles. So does all this suggest a Luigi's Mansion 3 Nintendo Switch 2 edition could be coming for this year? I've certainly long thought it's a plausible candidate for release. A small expansion of Luigi's Mansion 3 might take development time from the core game, but equally it could be a chance to inaugurate a side team alongside Next Level Games to work on the property. And fortunately for Nintendo, they have such a team, the Tantalus Media Group that worked on Luigi's Mansion 2. Now, many people will have heard the name Tantalus Media connected to Zelda recently, and of course, they did also create the HD versions of Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, but what many people miss in commenting on this topic is what is evident from a perusal of the credits, which is that the Luigi's Mansion 2 HD and the Zelda HD teams at Tantalus seem to be pretty much completely separate. I am convinced that the Zelda team are working on a new project for Nintendo because when you have a substantial cluster of people with Zelda credits and nothing else in the last decade, it does seem to point to a further project from the same group of people. For the same reason, I think there'll be another Pikmin group from 8ing and another Metroid game from Mercury Steam, even though both 8ing and Mercury Steam have released other titles in the last few years. But in the case of the Luigi's Mansion group, it's also completely plausible that Nintendo will want a team that can take the heavy lifting off of Next Level Games, at least in part. I'm reminded of the case here of 8ing, who handled Pikmin 3 Deluxe and then contributed heavily to Pikmin 4. An English-speaking studio like the Australian Tantalus would be a good option to collaborate with the Canadian Next Level Games, and I'm sure the final goal will be to manage to have 2 concurrent Luigi's Mansion projects in development at any one time. This might seem like a stretch, as Luigi's Mansion's remit is much more strictly defined than Mario. I mean, how many haunted houses can one plumber face? However, I think Scarescraper has shown that the concept could be used more broadly, and Splatoon Raiders has also shown that Nintendo are willing to essentially spin off side modes if they think they can make them work. A multiplayer Luigi's Mansion title feels eminently plausible, therefore. Although I should emphasize that I think this is very much a long-term possibility. I think the likelihood is that we will get some kind of Luigi's Mansion 3 glow-up for 2026, possibly then Luigi's Mansion 4 for 2029, and it will be the 2030s before we have two types of Luigi's Mansion in development, potentially. So in terms of forecasting, I try to give my judgments percentage weights for posterity's sake, and while I don't usually stack forecasts quite like this, I'd say in terms of 2028, the chances are split 50-30-10 between Donkey Kong, Luigi's Mansion, and Animal Crossing, and thereby, by implication, a 10% chance that it's something else entirely, such as Star Fox. Obviously, because I only use 5 percentage bands, this kind of warps the balance of probabilities I'm choosing here, but we'll go on with that for now. I think a Luigi's Mansion film announcement before the end of 2028 is a 70% chance, though. A Donkey Kong film in the same period, a 90% chance for announcement, and a Star Fox film announcement in the same period isn't inconceivable either. But while the strike while the iron's hot philosophy does have some merit, on balance, I think Nintendo will want to focus on the more immediately successful properties. I'm therefore giving Star Fox a 30% chance in this time frame, but that's not to say it couldn't come in the years that follow soon after. At any rate, thanks so much for watching. Do check out the Patreon for more, and check out the videos on screen for further commentary on this kind of topic. Thank you so much, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.